Kia ora and welcome to Sector Report, in which we investigate the wine industry. It's hit some rough weather in the last year or two, with record seasons producing a wine glut that has sent prices tumbling. The industry is still struggling to cope with the spin-off. I talked to Grape Growers Council Chairman Stuart Smith about the causes and effects of that wine glut. And here in Hawke's Bay, we visit two wineries to see how they are coping with the tough times. I also talked to wine industry elder statesman Villa Maria's Sir George Fistonich. But first, Stuart Smith. Well, Stuart, welcome to the Sector Report here on Country 99, where we're taking a close-up look at the wine industry. Now, that industry is doing it tough at the moment. Can you give me a thumbnail sketch of the factors that have combined to make times so difficult for both contract grape growers and winemakers, because they do fall into two different categories?
The oversupply situation in 2008, we had a record vintage, which followed 2007, which was in itself a record vintage. But the size of the 08 vintage was such that the market demand was greatly exceeded by the supply. We managed to sell through that wine, but it has been at a huge cost of profitability. Combining that with the global financial crisis, it's been pretty tough times. So 2008 was a fantastic year for contract growers. They had very good returns because they were locked into contracts. The wine companies tended not to see what was coming until they had it all in the winery. Then 2009 came along. The wineries did it pretty tough in 2008. 2009, the growers' returns went down, and again in 2010 with quite strict yield caps. So the pain has been shared around, and as you can see that in the odd receivership around.
Absolutely. I was going to ask you, how are these factors showing up on the ground? I mean, are smaller operators being forced to sell up, or at least put their properties on the market?
Well, there's not much selling, and I wouldn't say it's being defined by size. It really is more what your balance sheet situation is, as to what's going to happen and whether you're able to withstand the financial ill winds or not.
It would tend to affect the smaller operators, though, wouldn't it? Because they've got less wiggle room, really.
Well, I'm not so sure about that. I think often the smaller growers tend to have off-farm income and they're able to box on. The larger operators tend to have fixed costs that they have to meet, and therefore it can be quite difficult. I think the single biggest factor which determines survival or not is the size of debt.
Right, yeah, that is the biggie, isn't it? How many operations are you aware of that would be in receivership?
Well, there's about 3 or 4 that we're aware of at the moment.
That's in Marlborough, isn't it?
Yes, but there's been 2 or 3 around the country, and there's a few smaller ones that are quietly happening around the place.
How many properties would be on the market at the moment? I mean, I've heard a ballpark figure of about 150.
I think that would be, ballpark, that would be about right. It's a difficult one to really get your finger on. I think a whole lot more would be for sale if someone drove up the drive and with the checkbook. I think the key thing there is I'm not so sure that there's been a huge rush to put properties on the market. I think there may have been a little bit of that, but I think a lot has been that properties haven't been selling and for some time on the market, and that's due to a lot of factors, partly lack of capital. So businesses have lowered their production. We're all aware of that. There's been a bit of smart thinking going on, getting the production down, but keeping the quality up. But what's been the impact on their balance sheets across the whole industry? Well, exactly what the position of the balance sheets will only be known when properties start to sell, and you can get a good valuation on the assets. But it's been tremendous. I think the industry, if the industry was to experience another 2008 now, the balance sheets that wineries and grape growers have would not sustain the hit that they took in 2008. Right. I think that would be devastating.
Now, bulk buying, of course, not so prevalent now because production is down, but at the time it was at its peak after the 2008 vintage. Did that wine tend to go overseas and to the supermarkets for sort of cheap bargain wines, if you like?
The bulk wine has always been a legitimate part of the business. It's how wineries, trade surplus and actually get supply that they need if they're short. But that market has grown, and it's also grown because wine companies are bottling offshore. Some companies are for lots of reasons, not really the premium end, but sort of the value end of the chain. But those bulk exports really have been picked up by supermarkets all over the world, and New Zealand's not as well. So actually our customers, we've turned into our competitors often, and we've given them a stick to beat us with. So it's been pretty tough in the industry because those supermarkets are able to buy the wine sometimes below cost. They're taking a producer margin and a distributor margin and a retailer margin, and they're able to compete far more vigorously than the wineries can on the shelf.
Indeed. So I guess you get the situation where the production costs are actually higher than the price they're getting. Well, just finally, Stuart, well, you say that the wine industry has its own future in its hands. So how do you see it all shaking down over the next 2 or 3 years, just very briefly?
We're in a rebalancing and recovery phase over the next 2 years. So it's about getting our supply to match market demand. And it's about growing that demand for the higher valued wines and getting a better return. It's value growth, not volume growth. Then from 2013 onwards, we see the industry really starting to push out both value and volume. But value ahead of volume all the way is the only way future for the industry, really. We're a high-cost producer. We cannot afford to simply put out volume at the lower end. Lower end international market price for bulk wine is 50 US cents a litre. We can't bottle air for that.
No, indeed. Well, it sounds to me like you're a glass of Chardonnay half full rather than half empty. So let's hope your optimism is justified over the next few years. Thanks very much for your time, Stuart, and for coming up specially from Blenheim for us today.
You're welcome.
Stuart Smith of the Grape Growers Council there. After the break, join me here in Hawke's Bay as we see firsthand how wineries are coping with the overproduction backlash. Hawke's Bay is in the full flush of a very promising spring with plenty of moisture around to go into the summer. Although it's not been caught in the glut of Sauvignon Blanc production for 2 seasons in a row because of its concentration on full-bodied reds, Hawke's Bay's growers and wineries are still feeling the impact of the wine industry's tough times. We visited 2 wineries to see how winemakers are coping with hefty drops in price. The first we called in on was Grant Edmonds' boutique winery, Red Metal Vineyards, just outside Hastings. Grant works full-time at the much bigger Selene next door, but also has his own 7 hectares, producing about 50 tonnes of red wine grapes a year. Grant says times are undoubtedly tough.
The last couple of years, with the recession and a bit of an oversupply in general, it's getting tough.
How tough?
Very tough.
Enough, though, for you to even think about putting the property on the market,
to be honest, we have considered that, but to do it at this sort of time wouldn't be a good idea because values have dropped a fair chunk. Not too badly in Hawke's Bay, certainly not as much as Marlborough, but values aren't where they were 5 years ago, that's for sure.
And I gather there'd be about 150 boutique-sized wineries on the market at the moment. That's a figure I've heard.
I couldn't tell you about the exact figure, but that wouldn't surprise me at all. New Zealand has got more than 650 wineries in total, and I would say 90% of those are what you'd call smallish.
The price of a bottle of Grant Edmonds Red has tumbled with the industry-wide downward slide in prices. Bad news for a small producer.
It's pretty significant. Our main commercial wine, if you like, when we first started out was retailing at around $23, $24. And at that stage we had no problem selling it for that price. In the last 3 or 4 years, it's actually dropped down to the point where retail is generally about $15 or $16. So a significant chunk, obviously with a corresponding drop in the wholesale value. And over that same period of time, of course, a CPI increase annually in excise tax, so that's gone up from, I guess it was about $1.30, $1.40 a bottle when we started, to almost $2 a bottle now. So the margins have evaporated, and the short answer for us is looking at methods of reducing our costs.
So how do you do that?
Production. Well, one of the things we started doing in the last couple of years, which we used to practice many years ago but went away from, is with our leaf plucking, because we like to open up the fruit zone to a lot of sunshine and air, rather than using machines or even people to do it, we now employ sheep. They work extremely effectively and for a very low rate.
Yes.
So that's one thing that's saved us in this vineyard alone, probably something on the order of $8,000 or $9,000 annually, without compromising quality at all.
Along the road is the much larger Trinity Hill winery on the western edge of the Heretaunga Plains. John Hancock runs Trinity and owns a third of the action. Times are hard for him too.
I started in the wine industry in 1972, and I think definitely the last 2 years or so has been the toughest that I can recall in my time in the wine industry.
And you'd put it down to the glut?
It's an international thing as much as a New Zealand glut. Australia has substantial amounts of excess wine, particularly from the Riverland areas, but also Europe too. And now we're seeing quite big production coming out of Argentina, Chile, South Africa. It's all contributing really to quite a pool of wine internationally. New Zealand's not on its own.